Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out on this very warm but very beautiful day. I should say, welcome to Bedford, the place of God's glory in the Garden of Eden, as I'm sure you all know. I'm delighted to welcome James Crossley from the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements, which is now hosted by the University of Cambridge Faculty of Divinity. I've been practicing. I'm sure many of you know James, he's spoken with us before. So I'm just going to hand over and say welcome, and off you go.
Pleasure to be back, and well done on getting the centre's title correct. You're one of a very small number of people who actually get it right. Okay, I'm going to talk about some general themes that were crystallised around the end of the Second World War to do with war and apocalypse. Now, there are two types of apocalypse in this world. There are many types of apocalypse if you push, but two types for our purpose. Just to put crudely, good apocalypse and bad apocalypse. Okay, so there's a long tradition of the good apocalypse. Of course, you want the end times to come. Of course, you want your enemies punished. Of course, you want the world to be as you envisage it in the future. The flip side is, if you're on the wrong side of it, it's a bad apocalypse. You want to avoid this. You want the best to be delayed. Get it out. We don't want to die. The world is perfectly good as it is. Let's not change it and things like this. But we realise that the bad stuff is going to happen. Now, these two types of apocalypse were simultaneously existing at the end of World War II. One is very obvious. After the Second World War, after the First World War, the world was understood in apocalyptic terms. The world had, in some ways, ended or transformed, had been laid waste, all this kind of stuff. And so, as you'd imagine, that kind of language was very common. But at the end of the Second World War, the idea of rebuilding the nation, Europe, whatever, was also significant. And this was also cast in apocalyptic language. You might not see it at first, but hopefully by the end we will. Now, during the war, the Liberal politician William Beveridge headed the report that became known as the Beveridge Report, and it was about creating something like a welfare state after the war, so that people who were fighting would come back and have something to live for in New England and New Britain and all this. So some very famous phrases came from this. I'll just read a selection right at the beginning. It says, "Now, when the war is abolishing landmarks of every kind, is the opportunity for using experience in a clear field, laying waste to the world, and therefore it's also an opportunity to build a new world. The second principle is that organisation of social insurance should be treated as one part only of a comprehensive policy of social progress. Social insurance, fully developed, may provide some income security. It is an attack on want." Notice the capital. But want is only one of live giants on the road to reconstruction. In some ways, the easiest to attack. The others are disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. So in many ways, it's a very practical report on building an NHS, building a welfare state, all that kind of thing. But it's cast in this language, which is known apocalyptic language at the time. And if you go digging deep, some of the language used in this report, and what I'm going to show next, you can see how it's linked to all sorts of biblically influenced language, particularly to do with Revelation, but also other texts about fighting want, disease, ignorance, squalor, idleness. Idleness gets dropped out a lot, by the way, but it's certainly there in the background. Now, the Beveridge Report influenced profoundly the Labour Party in 1945. The Labour Party won a landslide election, really grounded in this idea of transforming the nation, building a welfare state, building a health service, and all this kind of thing. And again, it picked up on, quite consciously picked up on the language from the Beveridge Report and ran a little with it. So victory in war must be followed by a prosperous peace. Victory is assured for us and our allies in the European war. The war in the East goes the same way. The British Labour Party is firmly resolved that Japanese barbarism shall be defeated just as decisively as Nazi aggression and tyranny. Remember these phrases. People will have won both struggles. The gallant men and women in the fighting services, in the merchant navy, home guard and civil defence, in the factories, in the bombed areas, they deserve and must be assured of a happier future than faced by so many of them after the last war. Labour regards their welfare as a sacred trust. And then the whole document, this is the manifesto, goes on to talk about building a welfare state on the rubble of war. Now, these are just the examples, public-facing examples. Behind the scenes and in speeches, public speeches, Labour politicians were talking this language of a new Jerusalem, a transformed England, and things like this. And some of the background, I've given the text, I'm sure you know them off by heart, but anyway, there's something what I'm calling a vague Bible here. And what I mean by a lot of this is that it's a secularization of this inherited traditional religious language. Many of the politicians at the time were brought up from Protestant backgrounds, Catholic backgrounds, and used that language in political terms, not for overtly religious reasons, not to convert people to God or to whatever religion, but to think about transforming the nation in terms of welfare state and so on. And so you find biblical language everywhere, very vaguely there, never explicitly. And we'll see in politics, the last thing a politician wants is to be seen to be directly quoting the Bible. They need just gently allude to it. Another big important influence, and again this is cited by politicians at the time, is the idea of New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation. But of course, this is not just the New Jerusalem from the book of Revelation, it's New Jerusalem as has been interpreted. And in particular, it's Jerusalem from William Blake's poem, Milton, and of course, most famously in the hymn, And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time. The hymn was written by Hubert Parry in 1916 and contains many famous lines, but I will not cease from my mental fight, nor shall sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. So that's the thinking behind building a New Jerusalem. It's about it's not this heavenly mystical thing coming from the sky. It's about a real struggle to build a better nation. And of course, what's one of the hymns sung at certainly was sung at the end of Labour Party conference was this. So this is there in the language of the Labour Party. It's all there in the background. The other important influence, just as important, if not more important, but certainly significant, is William Morris. Well, William Morris published two very significant books that influenced the Labour Party, influenced socialists, influenced liberals, influenced even conservatives. And one was A Dream of John Ball in the 1880s. And A Dream of John Ball has effectively William Morris having a dream, going back to the 14th century, to the Peasants' Revolt, and discussing with them, and particularly John Ball, the idea of what England could look like in the future. Poor old John Ball thinks the transformation of England into a more equal society is just around the corner. William Morris explains that actually no, it's going to take centuries to build and transform England into something more with better equality and for people to have better services, people's needs to be met and all that. And again, Morris is absolutely crucial here because Morris explains how this will happen. He uses the language of end times to explain it, but in a secularized way. So when you think of in those times there'll be troubles, then the world will be transformed. This is not in what we would call religious terms now. He shifts that language into building a better nation through a welfare state or whatever, some early version of it. Anyway, there's a couple of key quotations here that get cited regularly by Labour politicians and many beyond. And this is from Dream of John Ball, both from chapter 4. Fellowship is heaven and lack of fellowship is hell. It's already kind of secularization of this life. Fellowship is life and lack of fellowship is death. And the deeds that you do upon the earth, it is for fellowship's sake that you do them. And the life that is in it shall live on and on forever. And each of you part of it. So even if you die, whose major contribution to bring about this new world, while many a man's life upon the earth, from the earth shall reign. Or another important quotation. But while I pondered all these things, how men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat, and when it turns out not to be what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name. So in other words, the narrator, William Morris, is saying John Ball, the Peasants' Revolt, may have thought there was going to be a better future, and they were right to do so, but it will come back around in a different form, under a different name, centuries in the future. And that has a big influence among Labour Party politicians and much broader. Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister, Labour leader in 1945, became Prime Minister. This was his favourite quotation, for instance. And when he became Labour leader, also before he became Labour leader, this is what he was thinking he was doing. He was bringing about the transformation of the nation under a new name. It might not have even been what William Morris envisaged. William Morris had a very floral and forest-like vision of the future, whereas Labour were thinking more in the language of machines and technology. He's saying, well, but still, we're bringing to fruition William Morris's dream under a different name. He also saw this as an inspiration for in the context of the two world wars. In the face of pessimism, it's passages like this that should be giving people optimism, Clement Attlee argued. So times may be bad, but you think consistently about what the future can bring. So all was good, and the welfare state was established, the NHS was established, and all that. But then we assumed into the atomic age. Atomic weapons, what we now call nuclear weapons. And from all this optimism about a new England, a new Britain, and transformation of society becomes the bad apocalypse returns with a vengeance. So I'm going to give a couple of just pretty prominent examples of people suddenly redescribing apocalypticism in terms of disaster. And this is worse than humanity has ever seen. So J.B. Priestley, the writer, but also editor of the New Statesman, wrote a very famous at the time piece on the bomb. And the language was apocalyptic, doomsday, the final seed of self-destruction, push-button arrangements to let loose earthquakes and pestilences and pronounce the death sentence of continents, universal catastrophe and apocalypse, the crack of doom into which communism, Western democracy, their way of life and our way of life may disappear forever. No real security, faith, hope, nor charity in it. Allusion to the Bible again without having to say it. So this was an important moment in the framing of that language in apocalypse of the atomic bomb. Bertrand Russell is a very good example because Bertrand Russell was an atheistic philosopher, dedicated to his atheism, but still uses this kind of language to describe the new world. So this is again just in the aftermath of the war, the beginning of the atomic age. Russell says there are three options for humanity. The end of human life, perhaps all life on our planet. A reversion to barbarism after a catastrophic shrinkage of the population of the globe. And three, a unification of the world under a single government possessing a monopoly of all the major weapons of war. Very interesting, number three, by the way, because this is classic Antichrist language that Bertrand Russell is using. I mean, there's a lot in Bertrand Russell's stuff, his campaign against the nuclear weapon. So he said, famine due to radioactive spray, pestilence caused by bacterial warfare. Would not prophets tell the maddened populations that their ills were wholly due to science and that the extermination of all educated men would bring the millennium? Now, in some ways, this extremely negative language of the apocalypse as annihilation, I'm sure they meant it to some degree, but it's also something of a rhetorical ploy to get people to change their minds now before it's too late. I think we're familiar with some of this with the environmental stuff. And in some ways, this sets the scene for really to the present, because I think still the language of nuclear annihilation has been the end without any redemption is a common way of framing the language of the apocalypse. Environmentalism would soon turn into environmental language, that the end will be brought about, human life will cease to exist or be reduced. Human life on Earth will likewise be shrunk dramatically. And if you ever look at newspaper headlines, whenever there's an environmental issue, you could almost guarantee they will say things like apocalypse, exclamation mark, and things like this. So recently, for instance, the forest fires in Australia, just before lockdown and the whole COVID thing, apocalypse was the language everywhere, and then was replaced by COVID, of course, which used the language of apocalypse and so on and so forth. Now, one curious feature of the good apocalypse has had something of a strange revival, though whether everyone would agree that this is the good apocalypse is up for debate, of course. And that was through Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, in the aftermath of the September the 11th attacks and then the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, certainly Blair was not going to use New Jerusalem to describe invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, or Muslim countries, for obvious reasons, I hope. But he reapplied that old apocalyptic language of transformation from the Labour tradition for this new era. And I've got a couple of, well, I had a couple of, I've got one here. Oh, I've lost one of them. Anyway, so this is Blair speaking to Parliament, saying the threat today is not that of the 1930s. The world is ever more interdependent. The key today is stability and order. The threat is chaos and disorder. There are two begetters of chaos, tyrannical regimes with weapons of mass destruction and extreme terrorist groups who profess a perverted and false view of Islam. Notice language, tyrannical regimes, chaos, disorder. It was exactly how the Labour Party were describing Japan and Germany in the aftermath of 1945, and now it's reapplied to this. I seem to have a slide missing, so I'm going to read it from my computer, if that's okay. It's the next one from Tony Blair. It's also the last one, so it's not going to be a problem. And this, what I'm going to read out, was given to the Labour Party conference in 2001. So this is the eve of the invasion of Afghanistan. One second. Okay, so this is what he said to the conference, to the Labour Party conference. This is just Labour Party members. In retrospect, the millennium marked only a moment in time. It was the events of September the 11th that marked a turning point in history, where we confront the dangers of the future and assess the choices facing humankind. It was a tragedy, an act of evil. We were there with you at the first. So it's we, the British nation, were there with you, the American people, at the first, which is an interesting way of putting it. We will stay with you to the last. It is out of the shadow of this evil should emerge lasting good. Destruction of the machinery of terrorism wherever it's found. Hope amongst all nations of a new beginning, where we seek to resolve differences in a calm and ordered way. Greater understanding between nations and between faiths. And above all, justice and prosperity for the poor and dispossessed, so that people everywhere can see the chance of a better future through the hard work and creative power of the free citizen, not the violence and savagery of the fanatic. I know that here in Britain people are anxious, even a little frightened, I understand that. Don't kill innocent people. We are not the ones who wage war on the innocent, though. We seek the guilty. Today the threat is chaos. The starving, the wretched, the dispossessed, the ignorant, those living in want and squalor, from the deserts of North Africa to the slums of Gaza, to the mountain ranges of Afghanistan. They too are our cause. This is a moment to seize. The kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are in flux, soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us. Directly now referencing the Beveridge report, which was so influential on the Labour Party. Want, squalor, all this. You can very easily pick out these biblical references I've listed here from Blair's speech. Blair knew what he was doing with the Bible. He knew it fairly well, knows it fairly well. Alistair Campbell didn't want him to use the Bible. He used to put a red pen through whenever Blair cited the Bible, but when you do it in just these allusions, someone like a secular atheist like Alistair Campbell just doesn't pick up on them and you can get them through. Now, why use all that language of want, squalor, the Labour tradition and all that when talking about the invasion of Afghanistan? Firstly, it's important to note that no journalist, as far as I'm aware, noticed. They didn't notice the allusions to want, squalor, to all this kind of language of the religious influence past. And that, for Blair and Labour, was a good thing, I think. Well, Blair's advisors, certainly. Because, one, the British public do not like politicians using religion. British public aren't typically against religion and the Bible or anything like that. They do not like politicians using religion and the Bible. The typical responses are they're not to be trusted, they're using it for the wrong ends, that kind of thing. They're manipulative, blah, blah, blah. This is statistically backed up. People have done surveys of this, and it was something like 80% of the British public would be horrified if a politician used the Bible, things like that. And it turns up in interviews people have done on the subject. So politicians have got to walk this fine line when they refer to religion. They don't want to go too far, in case the public despise them for it, but they might want to reach out to a Christian audience at the same time. Or in this case, I think they're trying to reach out for another audience, and that's the Labour Party and Labour Party members. So this is number two. Labour Party members do know that language from 1945, language about want, squalor, disease, and all this kind of thing, and of New Jerusalem. All that. So this stuff is aimed publicly, but also at another audience, the Labour Party. And why? Well, the Labour Party, as you remember, was very uneasy about going to war, or at least Labour Party members. So this is an attempt by Blair to use that language to say, just as the Labour Party rebuilt Britain after the war, just as the Labour Party talks about New Jerusalem, we're going to do this in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it's reapplying this stuff now for a foreign policy. In other words, for Blair, it's the Labour way. Now, whether you're convinced by all that is another question, but that was the intention, and probably on Blair's terms fairly successful because the party just about supported him on it. But that is, I hope, some indication of some of the tendencies at play when people are using the good and bad apocalypse. And it's still there in British politics, even if the public and many politicians don't like that language at all. Anyway, happy to take some questions.
We got any questions, guy? James. Thank you. Perhaps just, I was looking this morning, I've been doing a little bit of research into the Panacea Society's reactions to the end of the Second World War, and particularly how they viewed VJ Day, or Victory over Japan, and what their views were in terms of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there is a deathly silence. There's actually, they acknowledge VJ Day, and that's it. There's no commentary. One thing they do notice is in the pile of newspapers from 1944 to 1952, 1942, there's a note halfway through, and it's been very carefully written out and stuck, deliberately glued to the newspapers that says, this is when the newspapers were taken over by the socialist government. And it's quite clear that everything from about 1947 onwards is to be distrusted. And it's stuck to the Morning Post, which is not a particularly old newspaper. But yes, it's interesting. And they continue to take the Telegraph, but they're quite concerned that everything's being taken over by the socialist government. And
interesting.
It's something they're quite worried about. But thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. I think one of the things that we forget with the Panacea Society is they didn't live in isolation, and how they lived and their experiences and their reactions to what was going on in the world outside of here. So anyway, are there any questions at all for James?
I'd just like to say that this is a never-ending story because it continues to the present day. If you look at the history of Jerusalem itself over the past 1,500 years, there's been chaos and then peace, then chaos and peace, almost every decade. Gaza at the present time is a serious situation. It's very, very bad the way it's developed. But Gaza was always a problem. If you look at the last 500 years, there have always been fighting between Gazans and other people who are living in that area. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to bring Islam into it, because you mentioned Islam there, because Jerusalem has been at war with itself for centuries, thousands of years, and there were no Muslims in those days. They were still fighting each other.
Yeah.
The Gazans were not Muslims. They were the Philistines. So this idea that chaos occurs, let's look at the prophets, for example. How many prophets, say the top 25 prophets, they all came in with very good ideas, like politicians, to change people's values. But they're rejected, and there isn't a single prophet that you can name that succeeded in converting populations to do the right thing. So you've taken a time capsule here, which is very interesting the way you presented it. But could you say something about how that might apply right up to the present time? Because there's obvious linkages.
Yeah, I think this is the question of Muslims is interesting, because Blair would never have used New Jerusalem because it's so politically loaded, and I think it's part of the reason why a Labour Party today don't know what to do with the language of New Jerusalem, because it's tied in with the Middle East so strongly that it can be misunderstood very easily. So it's there in the background if you know where to look, but it will be very carefully handled, the language of New Jerusalem. The language of apocalypse, chaos, order, you're right, it never goes away, and it's been there since time immemorial, and it's framed in different ways in different historical contexts. And that is just ongoing. This is a time capsule, as you said, and then we need to constantly just update this story with what's going on. I mean, we're already getting that language of, I mean, this is not obviously to endorse what people have said about it, but look at we see the images of Gaza as rubble. What does Donald Trump say? We can build a whole new world on this guy, make it whatever he said it was, hotels and casinos and whatnot. So in American terms, he's playing into a tradition there, and so this is constantly. We could update this all the time.
But that's not it.
Well,
he's doing it from his own personal ambition.
And he's doing it for various reasons associated with that, certainly. Now, I'm telling you where these things are happening, rather than making an ethical judgment on them. I could make an ethical judgment on them if I so wish. But this apocalyptic language is not owned by anyone really. It's owned by different groups and have different ways of appropriating it. So Blair would appropriate one way for a war on terror. Somebody like Clement Attlee would do it for rebuilding England, Britain. Donald Trump would use it more differently still. It's a shared language, this language. We can debate whether people are using it ethically we are not, certainly. But it's a shared language historically because it's been so embedded from the biblical texts onwards that we can't escape it. The first thing that happened during COVID was people turned to this language from right across the political and religious spectrum. So, I mean, it depends what you want to do with it. If you want to do the ethical thing, that's another question. It's not a wrong question, it's just a different question to what I was asking here. I'm just quite boring in talking historical terms and so on and so forth. Sorry, it's a little random, but you get the idea.
Well, last question. Yeah. Do you think chaos will ever disappear from the planet? Or do you think humans are too disturbed as a species to be able to do anything proper?
I like William Morris enough to think that chaos can be controlled in the future, but that may just be my wishful thinking. One thing I've learned from studying apocalypticism in history is never predict the future. You're going to be wrong.
So if it's never predict the future, it means no future.
Oh, well, I don't mean that. I just mean I won't predict it. I can't tell you what's going to happen. I wouldn't even dream of thinking how humanity can cope. I would hope William Morris is right and that we can transform the future into a better society and all that kind of thing. But right at the moment, things look a little bit grim, even in this country. Never mind in Gaza and the Middle East.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Just wondering, I can understand why in 1945 there was a Labour government, partly as a reaction against Churchill, the man from a different century, and on the other hand, the hopes for a new Jerusalem. Were there similar thoughts in left-wing groups in Europe?
Oh.
Notably in Germany, because, okay, it was a terrible time for England, citizens of England, but literally in many parts of Germany, Dresden and so on, it was apocalyptic.
Yeah.
So it should have been worse.
Yes, that's an interesting question too, because I can't tell you the whole of Europe. Obviously, I don't know the material well enough in different countries, but I do know examples, oddly, from East Germany. And what happens in East Germany is they turn to the two traditions: one to an English one, and one to a German one. So they looked at Thomas Müntzer, who was the apocalyptic prophet of the 16th century in the German Peasants' War, and ridiculed by Martin Luther, executed and all this. They use him as a kind of founding figure for the new East German state. He absolutely explicitly apocalyptic language, and they are now realising it now with the new state in the Rubble of War. And a related one was the composer Alan Bush, the British composer Alan Bush, went out to East Germany and performed. The first performance of his opera was in East Germany, not Britain, and it was about the Peasants' Revolt, about Wat Tyler and all this. And it's really about the founding of East Germany as this new utopian state or whatever. So absolutely explicitly used in East Germany, more so than I would say the Labour Party here. They were quite open about citing Thomas Müntzer. I can't imagine, any government here saying, "Well, let's go back to William Blake." Maybe I suppose would get looking, but you don't think of William Blake. When we think of William Blake, it's the hymn. It's not the wild pictures and things like this. But they were very explicit in East Germany about using this kind of stuff to describe the new state after the war. Yeah, it was like founding a brand new state after the destruction.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, James.
Pleasure.